My other criticism of community council meetings, what I was getting at is I don't think that they are representative. That is a challenge. And I think maybe that's a complaint that I don't go to the meetings and I should, and other people should go too. But I don't think they're representative. That leads to self-selection of the folks who are the most opposed to things now suddenly get a much louder voice. And that leads to sort of this stasis, this lack of change.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is University of Alaska Anchorage Economics Professor Kevin Barry. This is his second time on the podcast. For a deeper dive into his personal story, go back and listen to the episode from November 2022. Today, we will be talking about the way the private sector and the public sector economies interact with each other, the need for zoning change in Anchorage, and ways that our current community council structure might not be achieving what we would like it to. Kevin Barry, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You are a real professor at UAA as of very recently.
I am. So I am getting promoted as of July 1st to a full professor. I'm an associate professor right now. So both are tenured, but the title changes come July 1.
So you become a full professor on July 1st. Well, congratulations.
Thanks.
You have been on our podcast before. We talked about housing. Remind us how you got to Alaska. Catch us up on your kids, your family.
Yeah, so I met a girl in Laramie, Wyoming when I was in grad school in 2011. And then we wound up coming up for one of her friends' weddings in 2013. And pretty quickly decided, June 2013 is a pretty magical time, that Alaska would be a great place to live. And I finished my PhD at the University of Wyoming in 2015. I did a postdoc for a little bit at the Yale School of Forestry. And in the first year of my postdoc, a job came up in Alaska. And I applied without telling my then fiance that I was applying, because academic markets are weird and you don't get every job you apply to. And we wound up getting the option for her to come home. So she's an East High alum, and we got to move back to Anchorage in January of 2017 and have been up here ever since.
That is a great story, and we're so glad you're here.
Thanks.
And tell us how many kids you have.
So we have 3 now. We've got a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And we are getting the full experience of figuring out kindergarten and K through 12. And we've spent the last couple of years figuring out childcare as well. And
Does your wife work?
Fun. She does. She's actually at McKinley Research Group as an economist too.
Oh, well, we're both economists.
Yep.
The reason why we're here today is we're going to talk about the most recent article by Dan Robinson in the Alaska Economic Trends magazine for June 2024. And the article is titled Government and Private Sector Jobs. And basically, it was eye-opening for me as a legislator who sat on the Ways and Means Committee for the past 2 years, because a narrative that's pretty common on that committee in the last couple of years has been that we've seen a lot of government growth and private sector shrinkage. And what Dan Robinson is doing is looking at the actual data and actually writing beyond Alaska and how the government and the private sectors work together, and most often actually move in concert, meaning if the private sector grows, the government grows. If the private sector shrinks, the government shrinks. And Alaska actually is different. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think it's important in these questions to think about mechanisms, right? So in most of the rest of the United States and most governments around the world, government services are paid for by sales taxes and income taxes that are directly tied to economic activity. And so when the economy is stronger, there's typically more money and there's also more demand for government services. Dan does a really good job of bringing that up in the article, right? So if we've got a growing population, a growing state, people are moving to Alaska, there's going to be demand for more things like public safety, roads, education, that kind of stuff. And so they move in concert. And the other side too is government can enable growth as well. So it's not just a one-way relationship. If we think about, for instance, the current challenges in Alaska's economy, if you talk to folks in the private sector, they'll talk about labor shortages. And really that's a result of shrinking population that's partially driven by quality of life issues. People have been leaving the state because they're concerned about things like education, or they're just not seeing economic opportunity like they were, or they're not being drawn to the state like they were previously because the lower 48 economy is stronger relative to the Alaska economy right now. And so there's that two-way relationship where higher quality of life because the better government services can draw workforce up here. But then also a faster growing economy requires often larger government to provide those public services that people and companies demand.
He used some specific states as example. I believe Idaho was one of them. And what we saw looking at these other states as templates of the typical way that government and private sectors grow is that you'll see massive private sector growth and then some relative growth in government, and not to the same degree. It's like the private sector increases its number of jobs astronomically. The government increases the number of jobs they have. What you just said, like where you have more people, you have more jobs, you need more schools, you need more police officers, you need more road construction.
Yeah, so post like the 80s, in general, the share of jobs that are in government has been shrinking, and part of that's because the private sector has been growing faster, not because the government has not been growing. It's not been growing as quickly as the private sector grows. And usually we see a lot more variation in private sector jobs than we do in public sector jobs. The reason being, of course, if there's a recession, people in the private sector get laid off. If there's a rapid expansion, private sector companies hire faster than the government does generally. And also the demand for services doesn't immediately disappear in a recession. We can think about, if we're talking about government jobs and education, you don't close all the schools during a recession. You don't fire everybody in the Department of Labor during a recession, right? Those jobs continue and they are necessary even during slowdowns, especially if we're thinking about things like food stamps, Medicaid. A lot of government services actually expand in recessions, right? So we see that usually there's more stability on the public side than the private side. He brings up, interestingly enough, we've seen a larger decline in public sector jobs in Alaska post the Alaska recession and the current post-COVID slow recovery than we've seen in the private sector, actually, too. So Alaska is a little bit weird. And part of that is that driver that our finances are not tied to economic activity the way that they are in other states. So now the Alaska Permanent Fund and draws from that pays for a substantial chunk of our state services as well as the PFD. But that's not tied to economic activity in the state almost at all, right? Most of those companies and these other assets that we own are out of state. And that's intentional. We diversify that fund so that we don't see these huge fluctuations in revenues that are perfectly timed with economic activity in Alaska too.
I think the epiphany for me was when we hear that government gets bigger and bigger and never gets smaller. That's the stereotype of what is said. And that their overarching goal is to stop the unfettered, unregulated, infinite growth of government into the future. They're not wrong in that the government does grow, but the government is growing at a slower rate than the private sector economy. So if we want constant private sector economy growth, then, associated with that should be some government growth.
Yeah, I think as population grows and everything else, you're going to need a larger government to provide services to a larger population. That's just a natural result of more people needing more things. The way that I've heard it phrased often also is that government can crowd out the private sector. It can slow private sector growth. And like in the economic literature, there is some background behind this. Usually there has to be a mechanism for that to happen, though. So most frequently when we talk about the public sector crowding out the private sector, we're talking about like the US federal government borrowing large chunks of money, driving up interest rates, and then increasing the cost of capital to private firms so that those firms can't afford to borrow and do new projects because they just don't pencil out. That's not happening at the state level. Alaska is not large enough for that to matter. We have a balanced budget every year, much to your and all the other legislators and the governor's credit. You guys fight that out into the last minute to make sure that happens, but we're not borrowing massive amounts of money. And that mechanism is not really a problem for the state government. It's hard to see other mechanisms where the public sector could be crowding out or slowing down the private sector in Alaska. Now, that's not to say that, for instance, if we're talking about regulation on housing in Anchorage, that may not be slowing down like housing growth and keeping prices higher in Anchorage, but it's not slowing like the existence of, for instance, the Department of Health is not slowing down the growth of the private sector in Alaska. And in a lot of cases, it's symbiotic too. If we think about the largest expenditures from the Department of Health, that's Medicaid. There are tons of doctors in the Anchorage, Matsu area who treat Medicaid patients. It's a big inflow of federal dollars into the state. It leads to jobs and economic growth, right? That's a necessary portion of what's going on. If we want to talk about the construction industry, right, that is a large chunk of the spending that, like federal highway dollars and state infrastructure money, is a large chunk of the spending that occurs, and those are jobs as well. And so in a lot of cases, government doesn't crowd out spending. It actually is the spending that creates jobs and allows those firms to exist.
I want to talk about Alaska specifically. Something that Dan Robinson does well in this article is lay out what typical states have in terms of private industry growth and how that's associated with government, and then how Alaska is really different. And interestingly, the opposite has been happening in Alaska, really. Although the stereotype is that we have this massive unfettered government growth, we actually haven't seen that. When we had our issues with oil prices and we had changed our tax structure and we resultingly got a lot less oil and gas revenue coming into the state, our government shrank accordingly. And that is disconnected from the rest of the private sector.
Yes. So this is also potentially an issue with things like using GDP to think about the size of the Alaska economy. Oil is huge. It's very important for GDP growth. It's very important for employment, for spending in the state. It's the biggest player by far in the state. And a lot of that is not tied necessarily to economic activity. It's often tied to prices as well, and price swings up or down that are completely exogenous to what Alaska does. So there's certainly been cuts at the state level over the last several years. And I think one of the challenges now is that a lot of the easy cuts have probably been identified, and what's left is probably much more difficult. But the state faces that challenge of most of our revenues are tied to oil prices, which are fairly exogenous to the state. The rest is tied to the permanent fund, which is also beyond our control. It's up to the permanent fund corporation and markets to some extent, and us just getting lucky. But we don't have obvious things that connect economic activity within Alaska to the amount of revenue the state has to provide services. That would be a sales tax and income tax, something that's directly tied to economic activity in Alaska. And I've heard this referred to as the Alaska disconnect. This idea is fairly old at this point. And it leads to, I think, interesting discussions where people don't necessarily identify that the services they're getting have to be paid for by somebody. Because since the 80s, we've gotten them for free because of the oil industry.
I think the issue with the Alaska disconnect is the reverse incentive for immigration. That the more folks we bring into Alaska, the more we have to cut our pie. In terms of if our state revenue is completely dependent upon investment earnings and oil and gas revenue, the more people we have, the less money we have in a way, because we're not getting revenue from the population itself. So a bigger population, the budget stays the same. And that requires us to cut this fixed budget exogenous to the state of Alaska, the way you phrased it, getting cut into more pieces.
I think the interesting challenge here too is that from the private sector growth perspective, needing employees that we can hire, unless you're talking about fly in, fly out jobs, we need more people to move to Alaska. If we talk about making Alaska more family friendly, we're really talking about having sufficient teachers, sufficient childcare professionals, sufficient doctors, sufficient police and everything else. Those are people we need to move and live in Alaska. And so it sets up this interesting trade-off where the funding is there. And like you point out, the more people who are here, the less per capita funding that we have. But on the other side, if we want a large enough workforce to enable economic growth, we need more people here. And that's where I think some of the potential economic drivers that I've thought a lot about lately for a future of Alaska are interesting. They're all focused on drawing people up here. It's quality of life stuff. It's things like the K through 12 and university system that might draw young people or keep young people in the state. It's things that basically build a workforce who are interested and able to take jobs and to create businesses too. In the end, I think a lot of the discussion around entrepreneurship and keeping government out of the way is worth having. Unnecessary regulation is unnecessary. We probably shouldn't have it. But we need to think about if we have people and if we set them up with the tools to be successful, which often involves public investment. It's really hard to start a business without sufficient public safety, right? It's really hard to start a business if there aren't hireable workers who have the skills that you need in place where you can hire them. It's just much more expensive to fly your workforce in from Nevada and fly them home every 2 weeks.
I think to take it back to the article one last time before we move on to a different topic, I think, to put it bluntly, what this article taught me is that the growth of government does not mean that you are hurting your economy. And that in a healthy economic system, you would see the two growing and shrinking basically in tandem, that they in concert with each other, not in opposition to each other. And the fact that we've seen something that doesn't match that in Alaska, to say that we need to shrink our government in order to help the private sector, that's not the way it works in most economies.
I think that's pretty safe to say. So, like we've talked about, Alaska is unique in this situation that our revenues are not tied to economic activity. Most of the time in most states, more variability in the private sector. They have higher highs and lower lows, and the government is typically more stable. Part of that is, again, because of the services that government provides. Demand doesn't disappear during a recession. If you don't close all the roads because GDP is down, or GDP growth is down 1%, that doesn't happen. And so usually we do see more variability in the private sector, but the same general trend where both are growing. Like you said, post-'80s, yes, government as a percentage of jobs is smaller, but it's smaller because both are growing and the private sector has just grown faster. And like my point before, if we're thinking about the possibility of government to be a limit on growth, we really have to think about specific mechanisms. It's questions of, is it unnecessary or burdensome regulation? Are we doing something to change like the cost of capital or the ability to hire? And it's difficult to see that happening in Alaska right now. I would guess that much more likely there's limits because of lack of services not happening fast enough, maybe permitting and things like that. Potentially there's arguments around overregulation for some resource development stuff.
And it's almost like painful for me to ask this because I feel like it's being asked for the last 30 years, and but obviously we need stable revenue in our state, and it would be great if we had stable revenue that was tied to the population itself. And that's a long way of saying that we do need some sort of broad-based tax that would give us a stable revenue stream to fund our government.
That's usually how people say income or sales tax without saying income or sales tax.
Right.
But
I am.
yeah.
Let me say income and sales tax, or income tax, which I would say with the state's political environment currently, that's just off the table, versus a sales tax. And I think that because the governor has floated one, some fairly conservative legislators have floated one, that a sales tax would be something that would be more palatable in our current political environment. And I've seen the graphs. I know that a sales tax is less aggressive on poor people than cutting their PFD. And I know when we talk about PFDs, we're talking about Alaska specifically. No other state has that. I've said a lot of words.
So, I love the 2016 ICER report, the short-run impacts of the fiscal options. There's a few folks who quote those on social media constantly, and I also love those too, because as you mentioned, they make the point that PFD cuts are the most aggressive form of revenue generation. When you look at the figures for impacts on jobs and impacts on spending, most of the options have roughly the same impact. So it's really the equity issue that they're getting at there. And that's a whole discussion. And actually, I've got colleagues at ICER who are, if you really want to go down that route, I would talk to Brett Watson. He's our current PFD guru person.
I will drop a link to the 2016 paper in the show notes.
But just from a purely economic stance, like if I'm trying to picture a growing and prosperous Alaska economy 30 years from now, it probably has a broad-based tax of some sort. It's still drawing revenue from the permanent fund, regular draws, paying PFDs. And that we're getting a lot of our government for free effectively, and hopefully still a healthy oil industry that's paying taxes and employing Alaskans and doing all the important stuff that they do. But yeah, I think it's necessary to have some broader source of revenue. That's a sales tax or an income tax, unless somebody comes up with something more innovative. And that's, again, with the idea that the state is in a place where it's growing, where the economy is growing, it's diversifying more, and we're in a positive world. One of the things that I've heard talked about is if we get the permanent fund up to a certain size, then we're just fine forever. But there's an entire literature in economics around sorting and how people decide where to live. And one of the things that I constantly think about is if we did get to a place where somebody who looks suspiciously like me is choosing where to live, and Alaska has a growing economy, has good schools, good public safety, all the things that I care about, infrastructure is happening, we're building new parks and trails, stuff like that, and I don't have to pay any taxes, since I could choose between anywhere in the lower 48, I'd move to Alaska. And I think a lot of people would move to Alaska. They would go, hey, look, I can get all the amenities and pay nothing. And eventually what would happen is we'd have to cut the pie smaller and smaller until eventually we again needed some sort of broad-based taxes. But without something that's responsive to the amount of people and the amount of economic activity, if people are smart, population will always mean that we run out of resources and things are always trapped in a low quality world. The easiest way to fix that is, of course, have some tax rates so that we can respond by increasing funding for services as people move up here and demand them. In my crystal ball, that's the good world, is we pay probably some of the lowest taxes in the country, but not zero anymore. And services are more responsive to population and needs.
I'm currently reading Romney, A Reckoning by McKay Coppens, so a biography of Mitt Romney. And in the book, what he was saying in one of his 2012 presidential campaign speeches, quote, that free enterprise was the most successful antidote to poverty in the history of the world, that federal policy should be designed to support existing businesses and help grow new ones, that the best government was one that made the lives of job creators as easy as possible. That philosophy that free enterprise was the most successful antidote to poverty in the history of the world, that to me sounds very reminiscent of trickle-down economics, that if we just allow the rich to unfurl their business ideas that would result in more profits for them, that everyone would benefit, not just them, but we have this growing income disparity in our country that's been growing over the past 4 decades. I don't know if you could speak to that.
I'm going to throw you a curveball here. I think Mitt has a point, actually. I think if we look at economic development and capitalism in general, we have seen dramatic growth in individual real income. Right? People are much better off than they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. We've seen a boom in the products we can consume. We're sitting in a room with laptops and cell phones. We both own cars. Like, we live at a level of wealth that, at least for my grandparents, my great-grandparents, was unimaginable. This is Star Trek stuff, but Star Trek wasn't invented until my dad. So my grandparents couldn't have imagined that. But I think on top of that, making the bosses' lives easier also means keeping workers relatively happy and making sure that they have access to the things that they need to be qualified for those jobs, to be able to capture those same gains as well. So capitalism generates a lot of wealth. What society chooses to do with that wealth is an entirely separate thing, right? We can pay for things like Medicaid, Medicare, education that make everybody broadly better off. And there are potentially efficiency and equity trade-offs there where things get fairer, but we get a little bit less growth on the margin. And I think that those are important trade-offs to make. We shouldn't focus all the wealth in a few people's hands, and we probably do see slightly higher growth when we are more equitable, when we invest in things like public education so people have opportunity where they can do better.
I had a guest recently and I asked them if it was possible for someone to be too rich, and the answer was no. Do you think it's possible for someone to be too rich?
How rich are we talking here? Like,
Billionaire.
I would question, it depends on how that person got super rich, is the way that I would say. If it's a response to them creating something that eliminates world hunger, and the only reason they eliminated world hunger is because they got paid, I would give them the money and take the win of fewer kids going hungry. That being said, my own personal values suggest that person should be giving most of that money away as quickly as they can. But those are my own, that's grounded in my own faith and my own beliefs. I think that there's probably inefficiencies in one person having that much wealth, given that it's hard for market incentives potentially to work if one person has so much wealth that they can just ignore what the market says and make wasteful decisions. I think we've seen some relatively wealthy people make bad choices with large chunks of money lately, where they've destroyed large amounts of wealth because they're so rich that they don't have to respond to the market quite so much.
In Alaska right now, with no contribution limits from individuals, it's possible for a trillionaire to decide who will hold elected office. Money wins elections. And I think that's a place where that too rich person has too much power. And I don't think that's just an Alaska problem.
No, I would agree with that. There's certainly folks who are using their wealth for ill purposes, right? Especially on a global scale. We can point at folks who are using money and power to do terrible things. And in that way, I guess I would believe that we would probably be better off if people weren't quite so rich. But at the same time, we could think about folks like the Gates Foundation who are working to eradicate malaria and using their resources to do that. I think one of the downsides of a few people being very rich is that then their preferences for which problems get addressed suddenly matter a lot more than everybody else's.
Right. Around World War II, our tax structure was different in America. We taxed the wealthy a lot more. This prevented, to some extent, the massive accumulation of wealth at the very top. It meant that more of that money was going to the government. And what that meant is that there would be an expectation that the government would participate more in terms of solving this particular pandemic crisis or creating a vaccine or that sort of stuff that we've now given over to the private sector. That the Gates Foundation will deal with HIV and malaria in Africa so that world governments don't have to as much. And I think the way we did it in the 1940s might be the better model.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But my point is not to say which side of this I necessarily fall on. It's that there's probably a trade-off. That we may be getting slightly faster economic growth post-80s because of the liberalization in a lot of these different sectors, but it potentially comes at the cost of greater inequality. And that's a societal choice that we make every time we vote, right? We can pick different leaders, we can do different things. And then within that, people are guided by their own personal morals if they are the folks with that money and those resources. And so it's this choice of giving them the power to make choices based on what they believe versus maybe this more democratic approach to things. It's more equitable, but might slow down growth in one or two small places. One of the things I think is worth keeping in mind is that the US is not making such absolute choices in a lot of these things that we're talking about, like closing down economic growth to make the world completely equal, or making the world completely unequal to make a few people very rich and let growth happen really quickly. We're often talking about very marginal changes to things like the tax code that are not big.
Herman Cain was a Republican presidential candidate, had been like the CEO of Godfather.
The 999 guy.
Yes,
Yeah.
the 999 guy, which, by the way, does not get a sympathetic portrayal in Romney's biography. However, what came up in a previous interview I did was that doing a flat tax would actually mean that the very wealthy are paying more taxes than they are now because they are taking advantage of loopholes, and they have very high-paid tax lawyers whose job is to make sure that they're paying an effective tax rate of 6% or an effective tax rate of 5.8%. These sort of ridiculously low tax rates that they're able to pay by taking advantage of our complicated tax code. And to me, obviously, I want rich people to pay more taxes. And if that meant doing some sort of flat tax that meant that rich people paid more taxes, help me understand why I'm wrong. And
funding the IRS better so they could do more audits would achieve the same thing, because then people wouldn't be able to maybe take advantage of loopholes that shouldn't exist.
But the reason why those high-powered tax attorneys make money they do is that they guarantee that this will pass muster.
Yeah.
You pay me $700,000 and I'll make sure that there's no T uncrossed, no I undotted.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, if you've got people who are only paying these low tax rates because they're taking advantage of every possible loophole, right? They're giving to charity, they're doing all these extra things. In that case, raising the rate and lowering the rate, but eliminating all those loopholes may end up with them paying more taxes. That's true. It would also cut revenue dramatically, probably, because everybody would be paying that lower rate, right? You'd necessarily probably lose people. If you picked a rate, the last time I looked at this was a long time ago, but if you picked a rate that would be revenue neutral, I believe it would also be a tax increase for most people on the lower end. So most people who are very poor pay very little to nothing in federal income tax, for instance. So instituting a flat tax that's high enough that would be revenue neutral probably means they pay more. So it's a tax increase on the very poor. And like I said, you could get to the same effect just by potentially more stringently enforcing our laws if we think that some of these loopholes people are taking advantage of are not legitimate. I know every time somebody looks at the scoring for funding the IRS, particularly auditing, spending more money actually increases revenue. It leaves us better off. Like, there's more than one way to get at this problem. It's not necessary to cut all taxes dramatically to a flat rate. And flat rates are generally more regressive.
100%. I don't want to hurt poor people, but I want to make sure that the very rich are paying their fair share. I hear your point about funding the IRS to be able to hire enough employees to be able to do the work they're supposed to do. I think a stereotype that we have is that a ruthless boss is the one that makes the most money, and a boss that is overly concerned about the welfare of her or his employees may end up with very happy employees, but will also not generate the same profits as that sort of Gordon Gekko, ruthless business man generally, who is going to make profits at all costs, pay his workers the least amount that he has to pay them.
I don't know. I think the folks who do that certainly pitch it that way as they're just trying to make as much money as possible. I think that there's a lot of styles of leadership that are more democratic and less autocratic than that, particularly the ones that we teach in business school, right? There's a lot of strategies that can be personality related. But then when we think about motivating people, like inside the management literature, my understanding is that you can focus on those factors of paying people just enough to keep them happy. But a good manager often looks for other ways to be a leader, to provide extra benefits, flexibility, to treat people well. And in economics, to pay them something often called the efficiency wage, which is if I'm paying you just enough to get you to not quit, any other job can show up and offer you about that, right? You're going to leave a lot faster than if I keep you happy. And so managers often have incentive if they want to keep good employees, if they want to recruit good employees, to pay above the bare minimum. And so that is a bit of a caricature sometimes of the way capitalism works, that we need to be brutal with people. But again, free enterprise is a wealth generation mechanism, right? What we do with that wealth is up to us as a society. The idea of free exchange of markets, of people being able to buy and sell voluntarily, doesn't require us to be cruel. Mm-hmm. And that there's a lot of management strategies that are built around treating people well in order to get them to work harder or to make them be more loyal and things like that. But I've definitely had one or two bosses, I think, who fall in that world of, none of my current bosses, I've had one or two bosses who have fell in that world of, I'm going to pay you the least amount I can and work you as hard as I can until you quit. And then I'm just going to replace you. And I don't know that's the best strategy for a business.
Do you think there's value in a minimum wage?
Yes, there's efficiency and equity trade-offs with a minimum wage, right? So often we try and set them at a minimum sort of determined livable level. And the difficulty is it stops people who'd be willing to work at a wage below that necessarily from getting a job, if maybe that's the wage that they could be paid. And the flip side, the people who are able to find work are paid more, and so they're better off. And so, like all things, nothing's free, and there's always this trade-off. I think in most cases, it's probably a net good to have some minimum level of what people should be paid.
Right now, our minimum wage is $11.72 per hour. There is a ballot initiative that would raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour over the next 3 years. And I'm curious if you think it's okay to just leave it at $11.73, or is there value in raising the minimum wage?
There's things I think people should think about when it comes to something like raising the minimum wage, which is how many people are actually paid the minimum wage first, and then how many people would be paid the minimum wage if it was raised. So how many of those folks would be getting wage increases because of this versus how many people are currently not working because of the minimum wage, and how many people might lose jobs if the minimum wage was increased because firms might substitute away. Now, the ability of firms or the willingness of firms to fire people because the minimum wage goes up depends on how much market power we think they have. So if we think that they're artificially holding wages down, then they may just respond by paying the higher minimum wage and keep their workers. If they are paying just the market rate of labor, their price takers, they may have to cut back the number of people that they hire. And for the overall economic effects, depending on the size of the minimum wage increase, we may not see a big jump in unemployment. There's been a few really good studies on this. It was actually the start of the credibility revolution. It was looking at minimum wage changes in like the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area using the state discontinuity. So on one side, you saw an increase in the minimum wage. On the other side, you didn't, but people were crossing. In other states, you can easily cross the state line. So you can live in Pennsylvania, but work in New Jersey.
New Jersey raised and Pennsylvania didn't.
I believe so, yeah.
So the Eastern Pennsylvania could drive across, work a minimum wage job in New Jersey at the higher rate, and then drive back to Pennsylvania to live.
Exactly. And so they saw relatively small unemployment effects. Now, these are relatively small changes in the minimum wage. From my vague understanding of the literature, we haven't seen large changes in the past that are really obvious, that are good case studies. But then we also, you can expect from general equilibrium effects, right? Which is just a fancy economist way of saying, if I raise the minimum wage, all those people have more money and they spend it on goods and services, which leads to more demand for labor from other firms. On aggregate, the effects are usually pretty small.
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but in a labor shortage market like Alaska is right now, we've had so much competition. I think that right now, probably a lot of folks that would have been being paid minimum wage are actually making more than minimum wage because they've had to in order to attract workers. So ironically, this lift in the minimum wage, because so many folks are actually already making more than the minimum wage, may have very little effect because those people aren't making the minimum wage.
I mean, there's always a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. There will undoubtedly be some firm that has to lay people off because they can't afford to pay labor at the higher minimum wage. Nothing is ever, dear reader at home, nothing is ever free, right? But the ideal way to raise wages is through rapid private sector growth that leads to just climbing wages at the minimum wage is always irrelevant. And we've seen rapid growth in wages post-COVID because we've got a shrinking workforce and growing demand. And so we've seen wages climb pretty quickly as firms compete for people. It's gotten really hard to hire. And that, all things equal, is always going to be better than a minimum wage increase, right? Because then we don't need it if wages are just climbing. But of course, real wages here, we want to talk about inflation, controlled for inflation. And so there's a neat NBER study fairly recently that showed that we did see real wage increases, particularly on the lower end of the income spectrum, because those were the places where it was hardest to hire and where people had to compete the most for labor.
Will we see inflation if we raise the minimum wage?
Alaska is not big enough to impact like national labor or national inflation rates. I would never say never. Like I said, nothing is free. It's possible it might tick up in small places, but I would be very suspicious, given we participate in like national and global markets for commodities, that we would see massive inflation because of it. Yeah, Alaska is what like economists would often refer to as a small island economy. I know the maps aren't true. We're not actually an island, but we're just relatively small and we're open to trade with at least the rest of the United States with no barriers. And so it's hard for us to impact like nationwide things.
I'm just going to do a little plug. I have an op-ed out about workers' rights. One thing that I would say, most folks in Alaska are entitled to the minimum wage. There are certain jobs that have exemptions and don't have to pay the minimum wage, but most do. And even if you don't have a visa, you don't have permission to work here legally, you are entitled to the minimum wage. So moving up the minimum wage, there is a shadow economy of workers in Alaska that can be taken advantage of because they maybe don't speak English, because they don't know the laws here.
Yep.
And the law is that even if you can't work legally,
you still have to be paid the minimum.
You have to pay the minimum wage. So their minimum wage would go up.
Yes. And I think this brings up another interesting point. When we talk about labor shortages, when we talk about treating workers well, when we talk about attracting people, Alaska faces a challenge, right? In that we've had negative net migration, which has in the past been large enough to also outweigh natural increase, which is births minus deaths. And we have lost people, our workforce has shrank. And there's broadly three things we can do about that. We can try and retain more people or attract more people up here. So that's thing one from within the United States, right? So either get back what's missing in the past in-migration by making Alaska more attractive. That's very hard because the lower 48 economy is very strong right now. All the federal money that's hitting Alaska through the Infrastructure Act and all that, everything else that's hitting in the lower 48 as well. We can look at automation in some cases and try and reduce the number of workers that we need. That's possible. And I know people are working on that kind of thing. And then the last one, of course, is making it legal for immigrants and increasing immigration into Alaska as well.
But we see this happening in the schools, like that we're doing J1 visas for teachers because we're not able to recruit enough teachers from the lower 48 for a variety of reasons.
Of course. And we are blessed to be in the United States of America, where there is a line of people who happily move here and work. And it's a matter of helping people do it legally so they've got permission and the ability to work and take these jobs and do stuff. And that's really the third way that we can deal with things like the labor shortage in Alaska right now, which is bring in people from outside the United States or allow them to move here and work legally and become Americans.
So I'm going to drop the Dan Robinson article into the show notes, as well as the 2016 ICER study talking about the cutting the PFD being the most progressive way of funding our government. You had a very provocative tweet yesterday.
Which one was that? Yeah.
Get rid of community councils?
Oh, so obviously, for anybody who follows my Twitter, some things are more serious than others. I think particularly when we're talking about issues around housing affordability in Anchorage, there is often a knee-jerk reaction to every proposal that comes up. That is that we need to stop it and we need to have more community engagement and more studies and more thought and everything else. It's hard to say in any specific case when that's just NIMBYism raising its head and people just stalling for time. But every time it's NIMBYism, that is a strategy that people use. And when we talk about housing affordability in Anchorage specifically, we really are just talking about building more houses. We are talking about upzoning and allowing people to build more dense housing. We're talking about apartments. We're talking about mobile homes. We're talking about just more housing. If we want more affordable housing, we just need more housing. There are trickle-down effects. If we build luxury housing, it means that folks will move into those homes and move out of old homes, and people will cycle up and there'll be more housing available. But in the end, we just need to build more housing. And oftentimes we are getting stuck with this idea that we just need one more meeting and just a little bit more engagement, and then maybe we can think about legalizing building more housing. But I think from having watched the recent reforms, we've learned generally two lessons. First, the doomsday predictions that suddenly there will be nowhere to park downtown did not happen. But second, that no one reform is going to be so dramatic that everything solves all the problems and suddenly there's massive apartment complexes everywhere. We're probably talking a relatively slow game of infill and development over time. And it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I think the community councils are fine. They throw
No. I have some things to say about this.
But I think when it slows reforms and it slows growth and it slows housing affordability, we run into serious problems.
The first thing I'm going to say is that when I first started getting involved in municipal politics, which was fairly recently, 3 years ago, there was a big debate about allowing for the mother-in-law apartments to be built. And that was the big debate. Should we allow that? And what's interesting is that some of the community councils that came out most vociferously against allowing for those mother-in-law apartments to be built, once it was legalized and it happened, they actually did it. And they're actually now saying, hey, we've done this. Give us credit for doing this. Let's slow down on anything else. We just made a major change. And for me, I'm like, no, I remember you showing up and saying how this was going to destroy Anchorage. And now it's happened. It did not destroy Anchorage. And now you want credit for having, quote unquote, allowed it when you didn't. You stood in opposition to this change till the very last second. And now, a couple of years out, you're saying, give me credit for allowing this to happen. You didn't allow it to happen. So I feel like it's like pattern repeating.
Yeah. I think my other criticism of community council meetings, what I was getting at is I don't think that they are representative. I think that is a challenge. And I think maybe that's a complaint that I don't go to the meetings and I should, and other people should go too. But given they're unelected, I don't think they're representative. That leads to the self-selection of the folks who are the most opposed to things now suddenly get a much louder voice. And that leads to sort of this stasis, this lack of change and potentially overregulation, quite frankly. I didn't build a mother-in-law house. Nobody in my neighborhood did. I don't know if they did, actually. I have no idea. I don't look over their fences.
I want to talk now specifically about the makeup of community councils. I got my start in community councils, and I'm going to just share this very quickly. My family bought a house, and the folks who lived in the house was an older couple, very kind people. They were diehard attendees of the Campbell Park Community Council. And it was an agreement. If you move into our house, you're going to go to the community council. I did. I started going to the community council. My second meeting at the community council was an election of board members because I had attended one previously, and that was so uncommon for a quote unquote young person. I was like 44 years old. They elected me to the board. What that meant is that then I had to go to every meeting. And then I was really committed.
And you were locked in.
But the folks there who were officers had been officers for 20 years. And I think that's emblematic of many community councils in Anchorage, the over 30 community councils. They have a lot of the same board members for decades because those are the people who go to every single meeting. I I do think that they believe that their community council resolution should carry a lot of weight, but our community council, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, often there are more elected officials and folks that are required to be there for their elected position than there are actually non-board member community council participants.
It's 100% believable. And I think the last potential criticism of them is that they're only made up of current residents. And so when we talk about things like building new housing, the constituency for that is future residents, right? It's people that will move to those communities because that housing exists. And
that's what they're afraid of.
They just don't get a voice at all. And to your point, so I've been to, I think, 2 things that could be called community council meetings. So one actual meeting and one other thing where folks were invited to come talk to a developer about potentially building some housing here by us. I was there because I wanted them to build it. I hope that they built like a convenience store in the bottom too somehow. It would have been great. Didn't happen yet. But I don't go to them because I've got 3 little kids and half the time I'm at hockey practice or some other event. And I had to choose between taking my kids to practices and spending time with them while they're still young or sitting in 2 or 3 hour meetings.
Yeah. And note to community councils, nobody wants a 2-hour meeting. Like that.
No, Robert's rules exist for a reason.
It's too long. And you want to get younger people, folks with kids to come to your community council, make it in such a way that it's an hour.
I quite frankly didn't know they existed for the first couple of years I lived here. I think that there are potential common sense reforms that could be made to make them more representative. And one of them is maybe like mailing notices and having the election for officers be community wide and let people run if that's what we want to do. Sharing the consent agenda, putting things out to vote. If you emailed people or something, if it was something like a resolution, like trying to get more than the 5 people in the room. I know the people who go are generally nice folks who wish everybody else was there too, and they think they're representative, but the opportunity cost is just too high.
Hey, I will say one positive thing that came out of COVID. Every community council that I attend that's in my district is hybrid now.
Yeah.
We allow folks to attend via Zoom, which is great for folks with kids who don't have a babysitter, kids are in the other room. They can just put their headphones on, cook dinner, listen to the community council meeting. Yeah. So there are ways that we made it a little bit easier to participate. But even that, if you're doing a meeting from 7 p.m. till 9:30 on a Thursday night, it's very hard to do bedtime while you're trying to listen to a community council meeting.
That is my if we're having gripes with everybody who hosts meetings, please, no meetings between about 7 and like 8:30. Like just start it at 9, let it be late, and then actually the parents can show up. But like,
okay, as a morning person, 9 p.m. is impossible for me.
Yeah. Not to just complain and suggest that they be abolished and not exist, but the constructive thing is like reforms built to making them more representative and like possible for people to participate in without giving up the forever memories of reading my kids Dr. Seuss would be preferable. And like before, when we were talking about ways the government could potentially slow growth, that is an example is coming in and stopping people from doing things like building housing in a community like Anchorage, right? It's hard to know what is the one reform that will do it. It's probably a big mix of them, and making it impossible to do any of them holds housing values up. Now, I think there's an entire conversation we could have too about the weird dual role that housing plays in America, where it is often people's largest asset and most of their savings, but then we also want it to be cheap for people.
Exactly.
Those 2 things can't simultaneously happen.
100%.
Obviously, when we talk about building more housing, we're talking about bringing down housing prices that will impact people whose main saving is through their house. Mm-hmm. That is an entire other problem, but that's housing affordability. You just can't have the asset do both things. Another common NIMBY talking point is we have plenty of housing in the United States. What it doesn't take into account is that housing is often in communities where people don't want to live and there are not jobs. Right? An empty building in rural Kansas is not a house that should be counted as part of the market for even Kansas, right? If somebody wants to live in Kansas City and it's out in western Kansas, out in the middle of nowhere, that's not part of the same market. Yes, there is housing. That housing is not located near a job, a school, or what people want to do. When we talk about housing markets and we talk about shortages, we're talking about prices and prices to live in places where people's jobs and all the things that they want are, right? And letting people build enough that folks can live close to amenities and things like that, right? Which in Anchorage is the trail system, downtown, the hillside, potentially. And as I say that, again, nobody's talking about building like massive apartment buildings on the hillside. It's like maybe you'd get twice as many houses on a lot.
Right.
Maybe.
Right. I think that's the most recent version The home initiative, which will be at the assembly meeting shortly after this airs, is to discuss the new proposal, which is just to allow duplexes to be built everywhere. That we're going to allow duplexes, and they're defining duplexes, interesting, as not necessarily having a shared wall, but two small homes on the same lot being allowed.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things, rather than killing a proposal like that, there's policy changes too that can be made. If there's truly something dangerous or unhealthy or some other massive concern, we can always have specific rules against that, right? If the idea is that there's going to be, I don't know, bad structures built because they're duplexes and they're too small and that's dangerous for some reason or something, we can always write specific rules around that. But just giving people the option to do things, A, doesn't mean that they'll do it. I don't yet have a mother-in-law house behind my home. But B, it doesn't mean that it's bad for the neighbors either. Most people won't even notice.
Right. Hey, last question. Any books that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I just finished reading something sad and something fun. So which would you prefer?
Give us both.
So the fun thing is actually a horror book called The Watchers. It's coming out as a movie. I read it in 2 days. Only the first two sections of it. The third section, the twist is pretty predictable, but it's fun if people don't want to think too hard. And that's some Irish guy. I don't know.
I'll throw it in.
But the movie is coming out soon too. Looks like it might be scary, so it's worth checking out. And then the other one was Red Famine by Anne Applebaum. That has to.
I love Anne.
Have you read that book?
I haven't. I had Twilight Democracy is what I read.
Oh, cool. She wrote a history of the Holodomor, the genocide in Ukraine by the Russians, the communists in the 1930s, and the use of hunger as a weapon by Russia against the Ukraine. It's just fascinating, especially if one wants to think, coming at it from an economist, I thought it was really interesting because the Bolsheviks were just terrible at understanding human incentives, and it led to such mass death and suffering and such horrible things. And it's fascinating in light of recent history too, that we're seeing a lot of the same things occur today. The same relationship is playing out that's played out multiple times in the past.
I'll check it out.
That's
and
great.
Just little PSA, we love our Ukrainian immigrants in Anchorage, and we have our Ukrainian translation of workers' rights available on this podcast about 2 episodes ago.
Oh, very cool.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kevin Berry, for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
The books that Kevin mentioned are The Watchers by A.M. Shine and Red Famine by Anne Applebaum. I have dropped the article by Dan Robinson in the show notes, as well as the ICER study showing how different ways of funding state government affect the Alaska population. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com.